And then down here, we have the change in net assets, right? Minus 5,000, 95,000, 90,000. So what number do you care about? Or what number should you be looking at?
90.
The 90, right? What else do you want to be looking at?
Change in net assets.
The 1.6, the change.
They got a balance, right?
I'm not sure. So the short answer is actually they're all kind of important numbers to look at. So it depends on what question you're trying to ask, right? So this 90,000, that's usually the first number that people like to look at. And it's a helpful number because it tells you what's the net change in financial resources for this organization. And it went up by 90,000. But it's kind of misleading, right? Because 95,000 of that increase was actually for next year, right? You can't really spend it this year. And then this year, out of all the expenses and activity you had this year and out of the revenue you had available this year, you actually had a small deficit, minus 5,000. You could imagine this being even more dramatic if we imagine all of this activity was actually in the permanently restricted column, right? So this organization had a 5,000 deficit and then got a 95,000 endowment contribution, right? The total net worth would be up by 90,000, but 95,000 is in a bucket of money that you can't ever touch, right? So it's something you really have to be careful about when you look at a nonprofit financial statement. You know, it's sometimes useful to look at this number, right? But it's always important to ask, what's the breakdown between the different restrictions, right? So here I know 95,000 is temporarily restricted. So that could be a good sign, right? It could mean, you know, maybe this organization's building a pipeline of funds. But I really want to pay attention to this number here, because it basically tells you what's that change in that unrestricted bucket. Did it get larger or did it get smaller, right? Did more financial, because as that unrestricted bucket gets smaller, things start getting tighter and more nervous, right? You get worried more about if you can pay your bills or meet your payroll. So we know for this organization it went down a little bit. But if it has stuff in that unrestricted bucket, it might still be okay, right? It can still, you know, it can still maybe draw down on savings from prior years, or maybe it can borrow a little bit of money to cover that gap. But it has to be careful for next year, right? Questions? All right, let's keep going. So as I said earlier, unfortunately, these look different on the restrictions often show up differently on internal statements. And actually, depending on the accounting software that you use and how your bookkeeper processes things, it can actually look very different from person to person or from organization to organization. So I'm really just showing you one example. I think the important thing as you either start up your ministries or as you're managing your own organization is you have to figure out how your accounting software handles restrictions. And first of all, making sure that you're being accountable to your donors and making sure that you can spend the money in the proper way that you're supposed to spend them. And then secondly, to make sure that you don't have a misleading picture of what your profit and loss is, right? Because with that prior example, you don't want to be thinking that you have a 90,000 surplus when you actually had a 5,000 deficit, right? So I'm not going to be able to look at all your accounting statements today, but I'm going to show you one example of how it shows up. But be very careful, because some nonprofits actually don't separate it out in their statements. It's all kind of mingled together. And it can be very, very messy and very confusing. So this is something to kind of go back and check about. So here's a sample, and this is often what we'll see from like a QuickBooks for nonprofits type situation. First of all, you'll notice, so there's revenue here, expenses here. You got your change in net assets. And actually, it may be called revenue over expenses, or it could be called profit and loss. And then there's a section below that's called other revenue or other income. You'll notice first there's no unrestricted or restricted anywhere, right? It just says revenue. So up here, you may recognize all your different types of revenue coming in. And sometimes you can actually have that restricted fund transfer show up. And then you have your expenses, and then you have that minus 5,000 surplus deficit. And then all the temporarily restricted and permanently restricted kind of falls in this other revenue category. And then you'll get a total number. So instead of getting columns, you're just going to get one column that kind of separates things out.
Because I'm trying to figure out why is there the brackets at the top.
Oh, okay. The brackets just mean it's negative, right? So it's a negative 5,000, and
Why is it negative?
it's basically taking the revenue 155 minus the 160. So 155, the revenue less expenses, will give you your profit and loss. Minus
Right, so I
5,000.
got that part, but on the other page, you had it where it went from temporary restricted to unrestricted.
So that's me